If you don't mind, I'm just going to ask you just a couple key things. First, are you Jewish?
Yes.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
And you were born in 1932 in Berlin.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
What did your parents do?
My father was he was a traveling salesman and managing traveling salesman for a large shoe firm in Germany by the name of I think it was called Klausner.
Okay. What did your mother do?
She didn't work. Yeah, she didn't work.
Okay. 1932. You were young, of course. You were born. I meant 1938. You were young, which was 6 years later. Do you recall any of the commotion going on towards the end of the 30s? I know you were a young boy.
Well, let me give you a few things that might sort of give you put a little color on things, because I'm one of those who was very well protected by my parents, so that I was not exposed in a way that would cause me fright or cause me to be upset. But I do have a few events that I can recall. We lived in a neighborhood in Berlin that was a very fashionable one. You may have heard the name Dahlem. Mm-hmm. And we had a lovely apartment in a complex of apartment buildings that had just been built shortly before I was born, and my parents had moved in. And I do remember that we had to vacate those apartments around I think it was 1936 or 1937, because they were being taken over, of course, by Nazi officials. And we moved into town. And the only recollection I have of the old neighborhood as a child were the streets, because my mother would take me out for walks and what have you, and less of the apartment. Although I revisited it with my family years later, just to see. But I have a better memory of the other apartment because I was older already. I have a memory of 1936 when the Olympics were celebrated in Germany, particularly in Berlin. And the reason I have a memory of that is because of the enormous number of flags that flew everywhere. Both the Nazi emblem, but also the Olympic emblem. And I remember that Olympic emblem and never saw it again until many, many, many years later. And it was a funny thing because I didn't realize it was the Olympics, you see, and I didn't understand anything about that, but I do remember that. And another event I recall was when Mussolini came to Berlin the first time. And I don't remember what year that was, but I remember that I was on my way from our house with my mother to my grandmother's, her mother, who lived in a different part of the city. And you had to get there by subway. And in Berlin there are two types of subways, some that run over the ground and some that run under the ground. And to get to hers, we took the over the ground, but that train was stopped near under the famous Unter den Linden, that big avenue in Berlin, because of a parade. And the police had stopped all traffic for security reasons, and I remember that.
And do you remember experiencing any kind of anti-Semitism as a child?
Well, not personally, but my mother has recounted that somewhere around that time, as a child, I was very blonde and very typically German looking. My mother too, typical, very attractive German women. And we were somewhere in Berlin, and journalists wanted to take my picture as a representative, my mother and me as representative of German youth, when my father showed up. And then they said, "There's a yeet," and that was the end of that picture taking session. But I wasn't. He's a yeet, and that's what they said. That's what my mother said. Now I wasn't aware or anything, and so I never particularly remembered that. Then at the age of, I think, let's see, this would have been 1938, I guess. At the age of 6, I went to school. And by that time, public schools were already closed to Jews, so we had to go to I had to go to a shul, a school associated with a synagogue. And I had just begun to go to school, maybe a week, when the Night of the Crystals happened. And that was the end of my schooling.
Do you remember that night?
No, I don't remember that night. I only remember the next day. That I think my father and I went to look, and we saw the ruin that had been brought upon the place. And I do remember vaguely, as a child, looking at it and being impressed, but not in particular frightened. My father had been immune from all of these things until my birthday in 1938, when on one of his trips to the north of Germany, which he had visited regularly to see his customers, he went after, as he always did, to a particular hotel. And that particular evening, there was no room for him. And he was very surprised. Or at least he understood, but he was surprised. So he went to another one, I think, and then he did find a room. And so he settled into that hotel for the evening, and before going to bed, had dinner downstairs in the restaurant. And the next day, came again to the restaurant for breakfast and was approached by two policemen who asked him if he had been in the restaurant the night before. He said, yes, of course. And so they presented him with a newspaper. This is the story I have from him. And in the margin of the newspaper, next to an article that was reporting on a speech that Hitler had made the night before, he allegedly had written some remarks that were not favorable. He hadn't, actually, but that was the accusation. So he was arrested. And the news of his arrest came on the very day on my very birthday. And this I remember because my uncles and grandmother and so on were in our apartment, in the new apartment that I was telling you about. And we were waiting for my father to come home, and there was a knock, and my mother went to the door expecting him, and I went with her. And instead there were two policemen, just politely, very politely, informing us that my father had been arrested in the town of Cottbus, which is where all of this happened. And, consternation, but, nothing. Again, I was not particularly concerned, upset, didn't fully understand any of this.
1 second.
And my mother, the next day or the day after, traveled to Cottbus to see him because he was still in the jail. And I went to my maternal grandmother's, you see. And again, I don't have a good recounting of what actually happened, but I don't remember if I stayed there immediately for several weeks or whether it took a little time. But in any case, my father from jail was then transferred to Buchenwald, and after some month from Buchenwald to Dachau. And it was during that period that my mother went about trying to get us out of the country. Evidently heard somehow about the St. Louis.
Did your father survive Dachau?
Yeah. He was one of those that was, as you've seen in the movie, probably was released so that we could leave. Okay. And anyway, she managed to get the necessary permits and the tickets. And during that time, I think, as far as I was concerned, life went on reasonably normally, although I was, as I recall it, with my maternal grandmother. I think during that period, my paternal grandparents and uncles, brothers of my father, two brothers, were deported to Poland because they originally came from Galicia, which was early on was Austria, but then became part of Poland. So they were all deported to Poland during the period that my father was in the concentration camps. And my
How long had it been since you'd talked to him from the time of his arrest that your mother visited him until this time?
I hadn't spoken to my father.
I'm sorry. Had your mother talked to him?
Yeah, she visited. She visited him in the prison.
Right, and by this time that she was getting the papers, how long had it been? Would you say?
I think it was. Until she got the ship sailed in May.
And he was arrested when?
In June of the year before, 1938. When she actually got the papers and all of that, I don't know.
So it was probably about a year before they saw each other. There was about a year where they were apart.
Nearly a year.
Nearly
yeah, I don't think she ever visited him or could have visited him in the concentration camps.
No. That's why I was wondering after he was sent to the camp,
Right.
what window of time are we talking about?
Yeah, but we received letters from him.
He was able to write from the camp.
Yeah, he wrote from both camps. Yeah, I have them here, or my son has them.
Okay.
And so there was communication. And
do you recall some of the things he said?
No. I was not able to read his handwriting, and it's all German. And at that time, I remember I had no schooling. School stopped, so I couldn't read any. I'm sure my mother read to me what he wrote to me, because a portion of what he wrote was always addressed to me.
Mm-hmm.
So she wrote it to me then.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be, the sort of things father would tell his young son about being good and obey your mother and whatever. And I have not reread them since, actually, because I can't. It's difficult for me to read the handwriting, you see. And so, because, we don't, in Europe, you don't learn to write the way you do here. We do here in America. Mm-hmm. In any case, he was released, but I don't recall that he came back to our house. He must have come. Yeah, no, he came back to our apartment, you see. And then by that time, all the arrangements were made for us to travel, and everything was packed and so on and what have you. And then I do remember that my mother and I traveled by train from Berlin to Hamburg without my father, that he came separately later. Why separately, I don't know. A cousin of my mother's was living in Hamburg, or more than one, and we stayed with them until my father came. In the meantime, I think, or shortly thereafter, my maternal grandmother went to South Africa, where my uncle and my aunt, that is to say my mother's brother and her sister, had emigrated already in 1936, wisely. So she rejoined them around that time. Maybe, I don't remember whether she left before my father was released or afterwards. In any case, he then followed us to Hamburg, and on May, whatever date it was, we boarded the ship together with all the other people, and the ship sailed.
Tell me about the ship ride.
Well, the ship, as I recall it, was a very, very nice, first-rate liner.
How were you able to get the money to go? Is it something you had, or something that you
No,
had to sell?
my parents had the money.
Your parents had the
They
money?
had the money.
Okay.
Yeah. For me and others, the ship was, the memory of the ship was that of a luxury liner, which it was in its day. Mm-hmm. And it sailed regularly between Hamburg and New York, and I think in the summer had cruises, just as now in the Caribbean, you see, with Europeans or Americans in the Caribbean. So it was a very nice ship. Life on board, especially going out, was wonderful. and there were other youngsters on board. And I had an experience with one of those, in that we were playing, and it occurred to one of us to hide in a lifeboat. Now, in those days, the lifeboats overhang the ship, so we had to sort of climb over a railing to get into the thing. And we were having a good time, but we didn't hear the dinner bell. And so then everyone became alarmed because we didn't show up. They organized a search, and I think they even stopped the ship. And eventually we were found by a sailor. I'm sure we were punished, but I don't remember how. Well, that boy I rediscovered just last year. And it's because in the last 3, 4, 5 years there has been a reunion of the passengers of the ship. And I attended one in Ottawa.